I would like to start the very first session of the International Development Select Committee. It is a new committee that we've got here for this new Parliament, and it is my great honour that our very first witness is Professor Nizam Mamode, who is a Professor of Transplant Surgery. But Nizam, you're here in front of us because you have recently returned from Gaza and doing some work in the hospitals over there. We really appreciate you coming and speaking to us today. It's very difficult to get first-hand testimony, obviously, about what's going on in Gaza at the moment. So thank you for coming and sort of sharing your experiences. I wonder if you could sort of properly introduce yourself and what you were actually doing out there and when you came back.
Yes, so I'm no longer a Professor of Transplant Surgery. I retired from the NHS a couple of years ago. And I've spent my time doing work overseas. So I had a month in Gaza, mid-August to mid-September, working in Nasser Hospital with medical aid for Palestinians. And I'm happy to tell you about my experiences there.
Please, tell us, so when did you go? Why did you go?
Why did I go? Because I thought I had the skill set that could help. I did, when I was sitting in the convoy, going in across the border, I did have second thoughts, but it was too late then to get out of the convoy. And I think when we crossed the border, the first thing was really a complete sense of shock.
What did you see? What did you smell?
You see a landscape that looks as though it reminded me of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Devastation, buildings reduced to rubble for miles around as far as you can see. Nothing growing, no people, a few looters here and there, but nothing. You drive through that for about 20 minutes, and then you get to the central part of Southern Gaza, which was the designated the green zone. I can't bring myself to call it the safe zone or humanitarian zone because it was neither. That green zone houses about 1.3 million people.
What sort of area is that?
It's probably about the size of the City of London. You can walk across it fairly easily if it was safe to do so. And a large part of it comprises of tents. And when I say tents, some of those are proper tents. Many of them are just pieces of carpet and plastic stuck onto sticks. And these are in the middle of the road, side of the road, every possible space. There's no running water, no sanitation, no electricity, obviously. And people are having to roll those up and move on at very, very short notice. Time and time again, most people have moved 6 or 7 times.
What does it sound, smell?
Well, the sound is mainly of 2 things. One is drones, so there's constant drones. And the drones existed before October last year. It's been a feature of Palestinian life for some time. But now the drones inspire fear, I think, and they inspired fear in me. And when I used to debate about sleeping outside on the stairs or inside in this very crowded hot room, part of that decision was whether the drones had the ability to pick me off when I was on the stairs.
Identify you?
Sorry?
Identify you?
No, shoot me. So that's what they do. Those drones are surveillance drones, but they are also drones that shoot people regularly. And I can tell you more about some of the people I've operated on who experienced that. So you have this constant whine, which is very psychologically very affecting because it represents danger and it's constantly there. And the other sound that you hear are bombs, which were going off every hour or 2 throughout the month that I was there. And we spent the whole month in the hospital. We deemed it not safe to travel. And we were aware that there was a curfew, so we wanted to be in the hospital if casualties arrived at night. We did have a guest house We didn't want to stay there, partly because of the travel, but also because one of the MAP guest houses had been bombed in January of this year. So we stayed in the hospital, and a missile strike or an artillery shell would explode in the vicinity and the whole building would shake. Windows would rattle. You would look out the window or run outside to see how close it was. It was a constant feature of life. We felt we were relatively safe because we thought it's unlikely there'll be a direct strike on the hospital, but for those 1.3, 1.4 million people in that green zone, they were constantly being bombed day and night. And what I think I found particularly disturbing was that a bomb would drop maybe on a crowded, tented area, and then the drones would come down and...
Please take your time. We're incredibly grateful that you're making the time to be here today, and I can only imagine just how it has impacted you and will continue to impact you. And I feel, because you can't unsee what you've seen, but being able to share that with us really helps us hold legislators particularly to account. So we do appreciate the time that you're making for us today. Thank you.
So the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children, and we had description after description. This is not, an occasional thing. This was day after day after day, operating on children who would say, I was lying on the ground after a bomb had dropped, and this quadcopter came down and hovered over me and shot me. And that's clearly a deliberate act, and it was a persistent act, persistent targeting of civilians day after day. We had 1 or 2 mass casualty incidents every day, and that meant 10 to 20 dead, 20 to 40 seriously injured. Now, a hospital like Guy's, where I used to work, Guy's and St Thomas's, might get 1 or 2 a year. We had 1 or 2 a day. And 60 to 70% of the people we treated were women and children.
I'm sorry to do this, draw you a little. You say children. I wonder if you could tell us sort of the ages of the children. And you say that they said that they were lying on the ground from a bomb shock. Do you believe them?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, a 7-year-old's not going to make up a story.
We're talking little children,
yeah.
not late teens.
Well, from the majority of the children who were casualties were young children, but we had casualties in their teens, we had women in their 30s, and it was a very consistent story. And the story would be given as soon as they came into the emergency department. So I have absolutely no reason to doubt this. And the bullets that the drones fire are these small cuboid pellets, and I fished a number of those out of the abdomen of small children. I think the youngest I operated on was a 3-year-old who had a major injury to the artery in her neck, and we used the last shunt, which is a device you use to bypass the artery in the neck to keep supplying blood to the brain. We used the last one in the hospital because those kinds of things are just not available. She died about 3 or 4 days later from infection.
You believe it was deliberate targeting of civilians?
Absolutely, and there's absolutely no question in my mind, and it's been the experience of so many healthcare workers who've documented it time and time and time again. But my personal experience and those of my colleagues this was clearly persistent, deliberate targeting of civilians. And I've worked in a number of conflict zones in different parts of the world. I was there at the time of the Rwandan genocide. I've never seen anything on this scale, ever. And That was also the view of all the experienced colleagues that I worked with. One of the surgeons in my team had been to Ukraine 5 times and said, this is 10 times worse. Normally in a conflict zone, you would have a front line, you'd have fighting going on between 2 sets of forces, and you might get some civilians injured in that exchange. There doesn't seem to be a front line. There just seems to be 1.4 million people trapped, they can't leave, and having bombs dropped on them on a daily basis, and then drones coming in and shooting them. And there's plenty of evidence out there from Israeli soldiers that that's what's going on. But we saw it, we saw the results of it.
Thank you. Laura.
You talked about a child dying of an infection that was caught. We know that supplies getting in are extremely limited, less now than they have been in the past. Can you talk a bit about the challenges that you face because of the lack of supplies? How does that manifest itself when you're trying to do your medical work?
Yeah, I mean, so I remember one Saturday night operating on an 8-year-old who was bleeding to death, and I asked for a swab, and they said, no more swabs. We had operations being done with no sterile gloves, no sterile drapes at various points. We had lack of basic equipment. I did amputations on people who just had to take paracetamol after the operation as pain relief. That medical aid was sitting at the border and not being allowed in. We were not allowed to take any medical equipment except for personal use. So I was asked, could I bring thyroid medication for some people? Couldn't take it in. That's a deliberate policy. And that's changed because I know that teams earlier in the year had been able to take some medical equipment in. So again, that seems to me to be a deliberate restriction of medical supplies. And basic things like soap, shampoo, that's not being allowed in. I saw, I don't know how many wounds with maggots in. One of my colleagues took maggots out of a child's throat in intensive care. There were flies in the operating theatre landing in the wounds. It was appalling, and that's a deliberate choice. It's not an accident.
In light of those challenges, how did you attempt to manage sterilisation, infection
You just do the best you can, but a large number of our patients, perhaps the majority, I don't know, would survive the operation and die of infections afterwards. And I think, there was a doctor in his 30s who worked in intensive care in the hospital. He got hepatitis A, which is a disease of poor hygiene. It's a disease for which there's a vaccination. I've been vaccinated. He didn't have access to the vaccine. He became unwell. He became a patient in his own ITU. He didn't have the treatment that he could have had in a proper environment, and he died in his own ITU. We asked for him to be evacuated, but he wasn't.
Thank you. It sounds medieval, what you're describing.
Yes, undoubtedly. And remember that Nasser Hospital, at the time that I was there, was probably the best hospital in Gaza. Most other hospitals did not have the facilities and the equipment that Nasser had, and Nasser was barely functioning as a hospital, and was being run by staff, many of whom had very, very little experience, because so many medical staff have been detained, been killed. Some have left when they were able to leave. So in intensive care, for example, was run basically by general practitioners who'd had very minimal training. So the cost in life and in suffering from that side of things is very substantial, because you don't have the equipment, you don't have the staff, you don't have the facilities, and even getting access to the hospital. An ambulance was shot while I was there, several bullet holes in the windscreen while it was going to pick up casualties. I think it's something like 163 or more documented examples of ambulances being targeted. So many people never got an ambulance. People would carry casualties in, sometimes bring them in on donkey carts. And when a mass casualty incident happened, we'd have the whole emergency department full. People would be lying on the floor in pools of blood. And it would be a case of trying to decide who was alive and might survive with some treatment, and who could wait a bit. And that was pretty much every day. And that's been going on for a very long time now.
Sorry, the information you're giving is throwing us, but we're glad that you're giving it to us. Alice?
Yeah, thank you. It's very powerful testimony. You mentioned at the beginning that about 60%, I think, of the people you were saying were women and children. Can you just expand a little bit more on the kind of effects that you were seeing on women and children? Presumably, there would be pregnant women coming in, for example, just to talk about some of the challenges that you were seeing, particularly when it comes to those two groups of vulnerable people.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be pregnant in Gaza at the moment. We didn't deal directly with women giving birth. That was dealt with elsewhere, so I didn't have experience of that. But you would have people with blast injuries, abdominal injuries, chest injuries, limbs blown off, head injuries. We saw a number of children with sniper injuries to the head, single shot to the head, no other injuries. So clearly deliberately targeted by Israeli snipers. And yeah, that was day after day.
Maybe just ask a follow-up question in terms of, the horrendous things you're describing, drone targeting, snipers, as you just mentioned. How was that kind of, in terms of what you were seeing happening, how was that kind of, was there a way to kind of bring some of that together in the same way that you're sharing this evidence with us here now? Was that shared back on the ground in different ways with different people?
Do you mean with people in Gaza?
Yeah.
You mean how is it documented? Or?
Yeah, how's it documented, yeah, if it's possible to do that.
It's not really. I mean, the emergency department is chaos most of the time.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, there are no medical notes anymore. There'll be literally little scraps of paper that people would write something on saying, had an amputation, come back in a week on discharge. That was the extent. There were, I think they documented the admissions, but collecting detailed statistics about causes of the particular trauma is difficult. I think, sorry, just to say one other thing, I think as you probably know, there's been a letter from 32 doctors and nurses from the UK who wrote to the Prime Minister back in September. They'd all worked in Gaza, some of them overlapped with me, and 99 in the US who wrote to Biden in October, saying exactly the same things. This is not a surprise. This is something that senior politicians, I'm sure, are well aware of.
Just additional question on this. What was the balance that you were seeing between
people whose injuries and suffering was caused directly by the conflict, e.g. bullets, bombs, shrapnel and so on, versus disease, hunger and other types of illness, affected by living in those conditions.
Yeah, so there were a lot of people with those problems. As a surgeon, I only kind of saw them peripherally coming through. So we would, on a daily basis, there'd be several people coming to the emergency department, for example, with diabetic ketoacidosis. So these would be diabetics who didn't have access to insulin, and then they would develop a diabetic coma. So you have to go back to the 30s and 40s in this country for that to happen. Insulin needs to be kept in a fridge. If you're living in a tent, how do you store it? How do you even get hold of it? So there were lots of those examples. Colleagues who were working in primary care were describing huge amounts of infectious disease, particularly amongst children. We certainly saw malnourished children, and I think that's just getting worse and worse and worse now. And then, of course, there are all the other normal conditions, if you like. So we came across people with bowel cancer, and they got an operation, but it wasn't a curative operation because there's no chemotherapy, no radiotherapy. So all the kind of ancillary services that existed before the war, they had some very good hospitals with very good facilities and very good staff. They've all gone. They've been destroyed. So there's a huge uncounted cost to the war. And there was a paper in the Lancet in July estimating, because of that, both the casualties that had been counted, those that were likely to be under the rubble, and all of those who were dying from other diseases as a result of the war. They estimated conservatively 186,000 dead. That was in those figures up to June. So to my mind, it's over 200,000 now.
Okay.
You talked about colleagues who had been detained and killed.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of how many colleagues you were working amongst in the hospital?
How many colleagues I was working with?
Yeah, with you.
Do you mean Palestinian colleagues?
Yes, local colleagues.
Well, there were quite a few. I would have to guess there's probably about 20, 25 doctors in the hospital. Maybe more, I don't know. But there were many, many more before the war, and many of the doctors I was working with had been in the north and had fled the north, and were now making up the numbers in the south.
You also talked about ambulances being targeted. Did you feel safe?
I felt relatively safe in the sense that I thought it was unlikely they'd drop a 2,000-pound bomb directly on the hospital. But we were worried about drones, couldn't leave the hospital, and travelling in and out was probably the most nerve-wracking thing. So we travelled in and out on a UN convoy in armoured vehicles. That's been shot at 5 times by the Israelis. And these are convoys that are very carefully organised, so they follow a predetermined route given to them by the Israeli army. There's a radio check at the start before they leave, during the journey and at the end. So the Israeli army know that they're there and where they are. And despite that, 5 times, including while we were there, they've been shot at. So my biggest fear while I was there was being killed by the Israelis.
The convoys that were shot at, was this sort of a rogue sniper, or was this...
No, this is the Israeli army coming up as a unit and deliberately shooting. And
UN convoy?
Yes. So the last one, when I was there, I think it would have been about the end of August, it was reported some WHO staff, and these are armoured vehicles, so you can see, I think, 4, 5 bullet marks in the window, just where someone would have been sitting. We were told, given very clear instructions, the doors are going to be locked when you set off. Do not unlock the doors. If the Israeli army shoot at you and order you out, do not get out of the vehicle. This is a UN convoy. It's got UN in big letters on the side, and it carries in twice a week. It carries about 30 to 40 aid workers from different organisations in and out. It's a huge number of aid workers have been targeted, and that's well documented. And again, to my mind, that's a deliberate policy.
Could I ask a question? Sorry, the drone thing, especially when they're shooting at people. These are single shots, or are they machine guns? I mean, are they targeting individual people with a one-off shot, or how does it happen?
Yeah, so luckily I never was anywhere near a drone firing,
yes.
So I can only comment on what we saw when people came in. So we would see people with sometimes a single entry point, sometimes two or three. What we did see on one or two occasions was a very disturbing pattern where there'd be 3 or 4 shots here, 3 or 4 shots here, and again in the groin. And that we all thought was prima facie evidence of an autonomous drone or a semi-autonomous drone, because a human operator would not be able to fire with that degree of accuracy that quickly. And there is some documentation that those were going to be used. It's reported in Haaretz back in April. So that was particularly disturbing. But most of the drone injuries we saw were 1, 2, sometimes 3 shots. And these pellets were in a way more destructive than bullets, because if you're shot in the chest with a bullet, if it misses your heart, goes on the other side, it can go through your lung and out the back. You'll probably survive. But with the drone pellets, what I found was they would go in and they would bounce around. So they would cause multiple injuries. So I had a 7-year-old boy, the one I described earlier, who gave a very clear description. He had an entry point here. He came in with his stomach hanging out of his chest. He had an injury to his liver, spleen. Bowel, arteries. So quite extensive destruction from a single entry point. And he survived that and went out a week later. Whether he's still alive, I don't know.
Thank you for trying. Gordon.
Thank you very much, Nizam, for coming in front of the committee. It's incredibly valuable to hear your testimony, and I have to say, in the 4 months I've been an MP, I don't think I've heard anything as harrowing as what you're describing. So, really appreciate you coming in front of us. I wondered, and I realise this is a difficult question to answer, if you could try and give an estimation of how many lives could be saved, protected, by aid that is currently sitting at the border crossing. What is the difference on the ground you feel that could make with aid that is literally being stopped?
It can make a huge difference. Huge difference. I mean, I've never been in a conflict area where medical aid has been restricted to that extent. I mean, it's not allowing supplies in, bombing healthcare facilities, attacking ambulances, killing healthcare workers. If all of that didn't happen, then tens of thousands of lives would be saved. And I would think that any army that is engaged in a war has a responsibility to the civilian population on both sides. And I'm seeing the opposite there.
I could ask a follow-up question on that. From your experience and your colleagues' experience working in other conflict zones, I mean, how different is this to, you gave even the example of Ukraine, and how different is it from a normal conflict zone in terms of the medical?
Completely different in every respect. And, I think that was a recurring theme from everybody, from people working for the UN, WHO, doctors, everybody. The International Committee of the Red Cross were there, with a field hospital. Most of the time in a conflict zone, the civilian population can move. They can get away from it. They may have to walk a long distance. They may have to suffer doing that. But, it's the equivalent of just putting a blockade around the city of London, saying you can't leave, and then dropping bombs month after month, and then closing down all the healthcare facilities. That's what's happening. And it's astonishing that it's continuing. I mean, we all found that it was beyond belief that this could continue.
Do you regard what you saw as genocide?
I'm not an international human rights lawyer, so I can't talk about the absolute definitions, but it's difficult to find another word for it, given what we've seen, and I certainly think that the Palestinian people feel that that's what's happening to them, and there's a sense of resignation that they're all just waiting to die with no chance of escape. So, in a word, yes.
The Israelis would say that they're dropping leaflets warning people to move to different areas, so it's not targeted at civilians. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, the green zone, supposedly they're not targeting, so most of our casualties were from the green zone, and many of them had no evacuation, no warning at all, just a bomb would just drop. We had a vehicle blown up 5 metres from the emergency department in the main street. We certainly didn't get any warning, and if I'd been crossing the road to buy something, that would have been the end of me. In terms of evacuation orders, the way it works is they normally send a message out on mobile phones to all the mobile phones saying area number, whatever, evacuation order. So if you have a mobile phone, and if it's charged and working, which is not that easy if you're in a tent, then you might have a chance, but the bombing typically would start sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. So I had one of the Palestinian doctors who worked very closely with me. We were on a ward round one morning, and he suddenly looked at his phone and said, "I've got to go." And he ran out the hospital, ran to find his the tent where his wife, his 2 young children, the youngest was 1.5, and his father were living, and they had to pack up the tent and walk for miles to find somewhere else, all the while thinking at any moment we may have a bomb dropped on us. And that's the day-to-day reality of life for all those people.
You've talked about this day-to-day reality, you've talked about children being targeted and healthcare workers being killed, and you talked about a sense of resignation that, a civilian will think they will die. Can you give us a sense of what they think about the international community, or do they think at all about what we could do?
They were very pleased to hear that I'd spoken to some MPs last week. When I messaged the colleagues there and said, "This is what I'm doing," and I said, "Don't know if it'll make much difference," and they said, "Well, small steps." I think they feel abandoned by the international community. They feel, some of them still hope that something might happen. And I think they appreciated hugely the fact that people were coming to help them and stand by them. That was one of the main reasons for going.
David Reid.
Thank you. Nizam, thank you for coming and speaking to us today, and thanks for having the strength to share your experiences as well. I know how difficult it must be. Going back to the sort of points around targeting, was there a threat that the Israeli Defence Force was seeing? Was Hamas in the community? Could you see where it was, or
Yeah, I'm laughing because this was the question I asked when I got there. So, you know, is Hamas in the hospital? Have they been in the hospital? And they just laughed at me. And they said, there is no Hamas. There's a few fighters hiding in tunnels. There's no Hamas. There never was any Hamas in the hospital. Everybody hates Hamas. And, you know, we never saw any evidence in the street, in the hospital. You know, as I say, I've been in conflict zones before. Normally, if fighters come in, they come in with guns. They come in with their friends with guns. We never saw any of that. We were allowed to go wherever we wanted in the hospital. You know, there might have been a tunnel underneath, who knows? But if Hamas were coming and going in the hospital, it would have been fairly evident, and I think they would have been probably kicked out by the people that worked there. I remember they described, with ironic laughter, they described one of their colleagues when Nasser Hospital was attacked by the Israelis in February, and they killed a number of staff, put them in a mass grave along with a number of patients. That's well documented. But they described one of their colleagues who was taken away, detained, along with a number of others, who was killed in detention. And they said, well, he was an atheist and he hated Hamas, and he was, before the war, he was very vociferous about those things. He just thought Islam was stupid, and he thought Hamas was stupid, and they took him away and killed him. That's what's going on. It's not as far as I can see, it doesn't matter who you are in Gaza. If you're Palestinian, you're a target.
Thank you.
David and then Noah.
Thank you, Professor. It follows on from what Laura was asking you and what Gordon was asking you, but on the subject of medical supplies, what would you say in the circumstances is the highest need, the highest priority in terms of the particular types of medical supplies that need to get in at this point?
Well, basic medical supplies, so adequate things like gauze swabs, gowns, gloves, antibiotics, painkillers, all those basic things. Those are absolutely essential, but beyond that, you need all of the other ancillary things. You need catheters to put into people. You need specialist imaging techniques and so on. I've been a transplant surgeon for most of my career, so I know quite a bit about dialysis. I used to look every morning on the balcony where our accommodation was in the hospital. I would look across to a building which had been the new dialysis centre built by Kuwaitis, as I understand it. And you can see that building's 100 metres away, burnt out. No shell damage, no bullet holes. There was no fight, no firefight there. The Israelis went in and burnt it out. So now they have 6 or 7 dialysis machines, essentially for the whole of Southern Gaza. And if you have kidney failure and you don't have dialysis, you die. So, to my mind, that that's just not acceptable.
Thank you, Nizam, for sharing these really harrowing experiences. Do you have a sense on the point of being targeted as medical professionals? And you spoke about the information that the defence forces have. I mean, what in your mind did you ever get a sense of any of the motivation behind some of these attacks, or is that very far away and distant for you?
Well, in terms of targeting foreign aid workers, so for example, bombing of the MAP guest house in January, one of the surgeons who was with me was there at the time, and a missile landed just within the grounds in front of the house at 6 a.m. in the morning. Some people were injured, luckily nobody was killed. All of those guest houses are in the Israeli Army's computers. They are designated as safe houses. So my assumption is that that is a deliberate attack, and that the aim behind it is to discourage aid workers from coming, and I think it's the same as the shooting at the UN convoys. In terms of attacking hospitals and ambulances and so on, to my mind it can't be anything other than collective punishment. It's just a consistent attempt to essentially wipe out a large part of the population. And I think the other theme that comes through again and again when you talk to people is the humiliation, the aggression. So I was operating on one young girl one night who died not long afterwards, and I can't even begin to describe her injuries. But when I'd finished operating on her, an ophthalmologist was trying to take out her left eye, which was just pulp. And he was a lovely, gentle man, maybe 5 years older than me. And he was, while he was working, he was just saying, yeah, when they came in February, they got all of us who were still here, they put our hands behind our backs, tied them up, put a hood over our heads, made us stand for 10 hours, beat us, cursed us in Arabic, humiliated us. And then some were taken away, some were killed, some were detained, some were released. We had a medical student who worked with us who described how the women had all been lined up and been told to strip down to their underwear and made to stand for hours like that, which is deeply, deeply humiliating, particularly in that culture. And then when they told her she could go, they wouldn't give her her clothes back, so she had to run through the streets like that, which for her was extremely traumatic. So there's a consistent theme of attack, humiliation, aggression against people who are simply trying to do their job, to try and help people in the worst possible circumstances.
You said they did this to the medics. Who?
The Israeli army.
Sorry, Laura, last question.
You were in Nazar Hospital, I think
yes.
You said. The situation in North Gaza is getting a lot of attention now, more attention now, for how awful it is. Did you have any contact with medical professionals trying to work in the north of the country? And
no, only in the sense that I think there was a group of Jordanian doctors sharing the accommodation with us, and 3 of them said we're going to try and get into the north, and they got turned back at essentially a border now, and weren't allowed in. But that was in August, when things were nothing like they are now.
Very last question.
Yeah, just in terms of going back to children and the effect on children, in terms of medical evacuations of children and other conflicts, you have seen that in terms of children being able to be sent elsewhere for treatment. Was that something that was you advocating for in the hospital you're working on? Did you see it happen? And if it didn't, do you think that is something that could be pushed further?
I don't think it's a solution. So there are a tiny, tiny number of people who get evacuated for medical care. If you were to do it in terms of need, it would be thousands going every month, literally. Because what's not picked up by a lot of the statistics is children who've had both legs blown off, people who've got ongoing problems as a result. When I left, the WHO was trying to construct a tented area within the hospital grounds just to deal with constructing prosthetic limbs for people who'd lost limbs in the war. It's a huge, huge number. And of course, one of the acronyms that is now used in Gaza is Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. You have so many children who come in as a result of a missile strike, and all their relatives have been killed. And then eventually somebody pitches up and says, I'm a cousin. I managed to come from a different part of Gaza. But what's happening to the children is appalling.
Professor Nizam, I cannot tell you my gratitude and the gratitude of the committee for both you coming here today, but for the work that you've done. And if you could express our deep thanks to your colleagues who are doing the same work day in, day out, we would be very grateful. And please assure them that you have spoken to us, but we have also heard, and we will do all that we can to act on your very profound testimony. We'll make sure that it's heard for everybody that is in a position to make changes on this horrific situation that you've described so eloquently to us. Thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it.